Welcome to a nightmare that began on an ordinary day. The car hummed along the motorway, a silver capsule of warmth and conversation cutting through the vast, indifferent green of the countryside. Inside, 4 friends were escaping the city for the weekend, chasing the promise of clean air and the rugged, unblemished beauty of the northern fells. Liam was driving, his hands resting easily on the wheel, his eyes on the road. He was a geologist, a man who found comfort in the predictable, monolithic certainty of rock and time. This trip was his idea. "Are you sure this place even exists?" Ben asked from the back seat, his phone held up in a futile search for a signal. Skarfall sounds like something a Viking would yell before cleaving someone's head open. Maya, sitting beside him, nudged him with her elbow without looking up from her book. "It is on the map, an old one anyway. Liam showed me. It is a real place. A real place that modern cartography has decided to forget." Ben retorted, grinning. "That is always a good sign." In the passenger seat, Chloe watched the landscape change. The rolling hills were slowly giving way to sharper, more aggressive peaks that clawed at the grey sky. She was an artist, and the shifting palettes of the scenery fascinated her, the muted greens and browns, the bruised purple of the distant heather. But as they drove further north, a subtle tension began to creep into the car, a quiet counterpoint to Ben's easy jokes. The sky seemed to press down, the light thinning. "We're turning off here," Liam announced, his voice pulling Chloe from her thoughts. He guided the car onto a narrow B-road, barely wide enough for one vehicle. The smooth tarmac was immediately replaced by a cracked and potholed surface. Overhanging trees formed a dense canopy, plunging them into a premature twilight. The GPS, which had been gamely trying to keep up, finally gave up. The robotic voice announced, "Route guidance is not possible," and the screen went blank, showing only their small car icon floating in a sea of grey. "And we are officially off the grid," Liam said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Just the old-fashioned way from here." He gestured to a folded, worn-out map tucked into the door pocket. For the next hour, they drove deeper into a world that felt increasingly disconnected from their own. They passed no other cars. The few farmhouses they saw looked shuttered and empty, their stone walls stained dark with damp. The road worsened, devolving into little more than a dirt track. Branches scraped against the car's windows with a sound like fingernails on glass. "This is remote," Chloe said, her voice a little smaller than before. The beauty she had been admiring had taken on a harsher, more desolate edge. The mountains loomed over them now, vast and silent. "That is the point," Liam said, his focus entirely on navigating the treacherous track. "It is in a glacial valley, completely cut off, supposed to have some of the most unique geological formations in the country. Precambrian granite pushing up through the limestone. It is practically unheard of." Ben leaned forward, his joking tone gone. "Did your rock book happen to mention if the locals are friendly to outsiders? Or if they have, electricity and a lack of pitchforks?" "It is a village, Ben, not a medieval fiefdom," Maya said, though she had finally put her book down and was peering out the window with a look of intense curiosity. As a journalist, this was exactly the kind of forgotten place that piqued her interest. They saw the sign for Skarfall suddenly. It was made of dark, weathered wood, the letters carved deep and filled with what looked like dried moss. The signpost itself was tilted at a precarious angle, as if it were trying to bow to the oppressive weight of the valley. As they drove past it, Chloe felt a shiver trace its way down her spine. It felt less like an entrance and more like a warning. The village of Skarfall did not appear all at once. It materialized out of the gloom, a cluster of stone cottages huddled together as if for protection against the looming fells. A thin grey stream cut through the center of the village, crossed by a squat stone bridge. The houses were built from the same dark, lichen-spotted stone as the surrounding landscape, making them look as though they had grown out of the earth itself. Chimneys breathed thin wisps of wood smoke into the damp air, the only immediate sign of life. But it was the silence that was most profound. There were no cars parked along the single narrow street. No dogs barked at their arrival. No children's laughter echoed from the small, overgrown green in the center of the hamlet. The entire village was wrapped in a thick, heavy blanket of quiet. Liam pulled the car to a stop in front of the only two-story building, which had another wooden sign hanging above the door. The Skarfall Inn. "We made it," he said, breaking the spell. He sounded relieved. They climbed out of the car, stretching their stiff limbs. The air was cold and carried the scent of wet earth, wood smoke, and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling, like old blood. As they stood there, a curtain twitched in the window of a cottage across the street. Chloe caught a glimpse of a pale face watching them before it vanished. She felt a prickle of unease. They were being observed. "Charming," Ben muttered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. "Has a real get murdered in your sleep vibe, does not it?" "Stop it," Maya said, but she too was scanning the silent houses, her journalistic instincts replaced by a more primal sense of caution. The door to the inn opened before they reached it. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was old, her back stooped, her face a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles. She wore a simple dark dress and a grey shawl. Her eyes, small and dark, seemed to absorb the light, giving nothing away. "We have a reservation," Liam said, forcing a friendly smile. "Liam Carter." The woman simply nodded, her expression unchanging. She stepped back, holding the door open for them to enter. The inside of the inn was dark and cluttered. The air was thick with the smells of dust, beeswax, and the same cloying herbal scent Chloe had noticed outside, but stronger here. The low-beamed ceiling seemed to press down on them. Strange, crudely carved wooden figures stood on every available surface, twisted animals and humanoid shapes with blank, staring eyes. "I am Mrs. Henge," the old woman said, her voice a dry rustle, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Your rooms are upstairs, 2 and 3. The key is in the door. Supper is at 7. Do not be late." She did not ask for names or payment. She did not offer to help with their bags. She simply turned and shuffled away into the gloom of a back corridor, leaving them standing in the entryway. "Well, she is a ray of sunshine," Ben whispered, picking up his bag. They made their way up a narrow, creaking staircase. Their rooms were adjacent, clean but sparse. Each had a simple wooden bed frame, a wash basin, and a single small window that looked out onto the village street. The same strange carved figures were present here, smaller versions sitting on the window sills. Chloe picked one up. It was a bird with too many wings, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. The wood was smooth and dark, polished by countless hands. She put it down quickly, wiping her fingers on her jeans. After unpacking their few things, they decided to take a walk before the light failed completely. They needed to shake off the oppressive atmosphere of the inn and the lingering strangeness of their arrival. The village was just as silent as it had been when they had first driven in. As they walked down the single street, they saw a few other villagers. An old man was sitting on a bench, whittling a piece of wood with a frighteningly sharp-looking knife. A woman was sweeping her doorstep with a twig broom, her movements slow and methodical. None of them met their eyes. They did not offer a greeting or even a nod of acknowledgement. Their gazes slid past the four friends as if they were ghosts, an unwelcome disturbance in the village's heavy tranquility. It was more than just rural shyness. It was a deliberate, unified act of ignoring them. "Okay, this is officially weird," Maya said, her voice low. She had her phone out, but she was not taking pictures. It was as if she felt that to capture this place would be a kind of violation. "It feels like we have stepped into a museum." Or a morgue. Liam, ever the scientist, was trying to find a logical explanation. "It is an isolated community. They are probably just not used to strangers. We should be respectful." But Chloe felt it was more than that. The air itself felt watchful, charged with a quiet resentment. Her gaze was drawn to the details of the cottages. Above almost every doorway, a symbol was carved into the lintel. It looked like a stylized eye, but with a spiral in the place of the pupil. The same symbol was carved into gateposts and the thick trunks of the ancient rowan trees that lined the stream. "What do you think those mean?" she asked, pointing to one. Liam walked over to examine it, his academic curiosity overriding his unease. Some kind of apotropaic mark, maybe, a ward to keep away evil spirits. It is common in old folk traditions. "So they are warding off evil," Ben said, his attempt at humor sounding strained. "Good to know there is evil here to be warded off." They reached the edge of the village, where the street dissolved into a muddy track that led up towards the dark, looming fells. A collection of standing stones, short and stout, stood like silent sentinels at the path's entrance. They were covered in the same moss and lichen as the houses, and Chloe could just make out the faint traces of the same spiral eye symbol carved into their surfaces. The path ahead looked dark and uninviting. The woods that flanked it were a thick, tangled mass of ancient trees, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. A sudden gust of wind sighed through the leaves, a mournful, lonely sound. It was then that they heard it, a noise that cut through the natural sounds of the valley. It was a high-pitched, rhythmic clicking. It was not mechanical, like an engine, and it was not animal, like an insect. It was sharp, precise, and utterly alien. The sound seemed to come from deep within the woods to their left. They all froze, listening. Click, It was a cold, deliberate sound, a sound that had no place in the natural world. "What is that?" Maya whispered, her eyes wide. Liam was frowning, tilting his head. "I have no idea. Could be a woodpecker. A green woodpecker can make a strange call." "That is not a bird," Chloe said, her voice barely a breath. The sound made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It felt wrong, intrinsically, fundamentally wrong. As if sensing their attention, the clicking stopped. The sudden return to silence was almost more jarring than the noise itself. They stood there for a long moment, straining their ears, but there was nothing but the sighing of the wind. "Probably just the wind in the branches," Ben said, but his voice lacked conviction. He could not meet anyone's eyes. "Or some weird local sheep with a cough. Let us head back. I am starving." No one argued. They turned and walked back towards the inn, the mood between them now thick with a shared, unspoken dread. The silent villagers, the strange carvings, the oppressive quiet. It had all been unsettling, but that sound was different. It was an active presence. It suggested something was out there in the woods, something unknown. Supper at the inn was a tense affair. They were the only guests in the small, dark dining room. Mrs. Henge served them a thick, nameless stew and dense, dark bread. She moved about the room with a silent, ghostly efficiency, her expression never changing. The food was bland and heavy, and they ate quickly, eager to escape her unnerving presence. "Did you, happen to hear a strange clicking noise from the woods earlier?" Maya asked the old woman, her journalistic instincts making a last, desperate stand against her fear. Mrs. Henge paused in the act of clearing a plate, her dark eyes fixing on Maya for the first time. The silence stretched. For a moment, Chloe was certain she would not answer. "There are things in the woods," the old woman said finally, her voice low and flat. "Things that are best left alone." "You are here for the stones, boy," she said, her gaze shifting to Liam. "Look at your stones." "Then leave. Skarfall is not a place for tourists." It was a clear dismissal, a warning wrapped in a thin veneer of hospitality. She took the plates and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving them alone in the flickering candlelight. Later, in their room, Chloe could not settle. The wind had picked up, and it howled around the corners of the old inn, making the window frame rattle. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, made her jump. Liam was poring over his old map, trying to pinpoint the rock formations he wanted to see the next day, but even his focus seemed forced. "She is just trying to scare us," he said, not looking up. "Old folk tales to frighten off visitors. It is probably a local game." "It did not feel like a game, Liam," Chloe said, wrapping her arms around herself. She stood by the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. The village was completely black, not a single light visible in any of the other cottages. It was as if Skarfall had been swallowed by the night. "We will go for our hike tomorrow, see the rocks, and we can be gone by the afternoon if you want," he offered, finally sensing the depth of her anxiety. "It is just one night, just one night." The words offered little comfort. They went to bed early, the long drive and the tension of the day having exhausted them. Chloe lay in the dark, listening to Liam's steady breathing beside her, but sleep would not come. She could not shake the feeling of being watched, a feeling that had started with the face in the cottage window and had grown steadily all day. It felt as though the whole valley was watching them, its ancient, malevolent eye fixed upon them. The spiral symbol burned in her mind. She must have drifted off eventually, falling into a light, uneasy slumber. She was woken some hours later by a sound, a soft scraping sound. It was coming from right outside their window. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lay perfectly still, straining her ears, praying it was just a branch, but the sound came again. Scrape, drag, scrape. It was the sound of something being pulled across the rough stone wall beneath their window. Slowly, carefully, she sat up. The room was bathed in the faint silvery light of a partial moon that had broken through the clouds. Liam was still fast asleep. Holding her breath, Chloe crept out of bed and moved to the window. Her hands were trembling as she reached for the edge of the thin curtain. She hesitated, a wave of pure terror washing over her. A voice in her head screamed at her not to look, but she had to know. She pulled the curtain back just a fraction of an inch and peered down into the village street below. At first she saw nothing but the dark, empty lane. Then her eyes adjusted. Standing directly across the street, half hidden in the deep shadow of the opposite cottage, was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs long and spidery. It was looking up, not just in her direction, but directly at her window. At her, Chloe could not make out a face, only a pale, featureless oval. But she could feel its gaze, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. And then it moved. It lifted one of its long, spindly arms and pointed a single, elongated finger right at her. A choked gasp escaped her lips. She stumbled back from the window, her hand flying to her mouth. Her heart felt like it was going to burst. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to erase the image. When she dared to look again, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she forced herself back to the window. The street was empty. There was nothing there, just the silent, sleeping stones of the village and the oppressive, watching darkness. Chloe awoke with a gasp, her body rigid, the ghost of a scream lodged in her throat. For a disorienting moment, she was back at the window, staring down at the impossibly thin figure, its long finger an accusation in the moonlight. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She blinked, and the dark, low ceiling room of the inn swam back into focus. Grey morning light, thin and watery, filtered through the grimy window pane. Beside her, Liam slept on, oblivious, his breathing deep and even. Was it a dream? It must have been a dream, a nightmare, born from the unsettling atmosphere of the village, the strange quiet, the unnerving innkeeper. Her mind had simply woven the day's anxieties into a tapestry of horror while she slept. She clung to this explanation like a life raft, repeating it to herself as she slid carefully out of bed. Her muscles ached with a tension that sleep had not erased. She crossed to the window, her bare feet cold on the rough wooden floorboards. Her hand trembled as she pulled the curtain aside. Below, the village street was empty. rendered in shades of grey and damp brown by the overcast morning. Everything was still, silent, exactly as it should be. There was no trace of the monstrous figure, no evidence of its presence. It had been a dream. It had to be. But the fear it had left behind was viscerally real. A cold knot in the pit of her stomach. Breakfast was a quiet, joyless meal of porridge and watery tea. Mrs. Henge served them with the same stony silence as the night before, her presence a constant silent rebuke. The air in the small dining room was heavy and stale. Ben tried to lighten the mood, making a joke about the porridge having the consistency of wet cement, but his voice was hollow and his smile was strained. Maya was not reading her book. She kept glancing towards the windows, her brow furrowed in thought. A sleepless night had left its mark on all of them. Chloe said nothing about what she had seen. How could she? I saw a monster outside our window, but do not worry, it was probably just a nightmare. They would think she was letting the spooky village get to her. Liam, in his rational geological world, would have a dozen logical explanations, from sleep paralysis to the shadow of a tree branch. She did not want to be the hysterical one, the weak link. So she stayed quiet, stirring her porridge and trying to convince herself that the terror was all in her head. "Right," Liam said, pushing his empty bowl away and rubbing his hands together with a forced enthusiasm. "Who is ready to see some truly magnificent examples of orthoniase and pellitic schist?" Ben groaned. "I am still trying to get over the magnificent example of gruel I just ate. Are you sure we cannot just, stay here and read? Or learn to whittle unsettling bird figurines?" "We came here to hike," Liam insisted, pulling out his map and spreading it on the table. "The Skarfall Traverse. It is supposed to have some of the best views in the fells. It loops around the head of the valley and brings us back down by the stream. It will take a few hours. The fresh air will do us good." Chloe's stomach tightened. The thought of entering the woods, the source of that unnatural clicking sound from the day before, filled her with a profound dread. The memory of the pointing finger, the featureless face, was too fresh. That thing had come from the darkness, and now Liam wanted them to walk right into it. "Maybe we should just stick to the village," she suggested, her voice barely a whisper. Liam looked at her, his brow creasing with concern. "Are you feeling okay? You have been quiet all morning." "I am just tired," she lied. "Did not sleep well." "All the more reason for a good walk," he said, his good-natured optimism impenetrable. "It will blow the cobwebs away. Come on, it will be fun." Fun was the last word Chloe would have used. But she could not articulate her fear without sounding insane. So she nodded, forcing a weak smile, and went upstairs to pull on her walking boots. Each step felt like a march towards a scaffold. They set off a few minutes later, stepping out of the inn into the cold, damp air. The village was as it had been the day before, silent, watchful. The same old man sat on the same bench, his knife making soft, slicing sounds as he carved a piece of wood. He did not look up as they passed. They walked the length of the street to the edge of the village, to the cluster of squat standing stones that guarded the path into the woods. Standing at the trailhead, Chloe felt a powerful, instinctual urge to turn and run. The woods did not look like a place for a pleasant hike. They were a solid, impenetrable wall of dark green and black. The trees were old, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A thick mist clung to the forest floor, muffling all sound and lending the scene a ghostly, ethereal quality. The air that drifted out to meet them was cold and smelled of decay. "This way," Liam said, consulting his map and striding onto the path with a confidence Chloe did not share. Ben and Maya exchanged a look of deep apprehension before following him. Chloe took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs, and forced her legs to move. The moment they stepped under the canopy of the trees, the world changed. The already weak light of the morning was swallowed by the dense foliage, plunging them into a deep, green-tinged gloom. The oppressive silence of the village was replaced by a different kind of quiet, a heavy, listening silence that seemed to absorb the sound of their footsteps, the rustle of their jackets, the very air from their lungs. The path was narrow and slick with damp moss, twisted roots, like the petrified veins of some great beast, snaked across it, threatening to trip them with every step. All around them, the trees stood as silent, ancient witnesses. Many of them bore the spiral eye symbol carved deep into their bark. Some carvings were old and weathered, almost healed over, while others looked shockingly fresh, the raw wood a pale scar against the dark bark. They walked in single file, Liam in the lead, Chloe at the back. The initial attempts at conversation quickly died out, the oppressive atmosphere strangling the words in their throats. They were intruders here, and they could feel it. The woods resented their presence. They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when they heard it again. Click. The sound was faint at first, almost lost in the dripping of water from the leaves, but it was unmistakable. The same cold, rhythmic, unnatural sound from the day before. Chloe froze, her blood turning to ice. This time, it was inside the woods with them. Liam stopped, holding up a hand for them to be quiet. They all stood motionless, listening. The clicking continued, steady and deliberate. It was coming from somewhere to their right, deeper in the trees. "There it is again," Maya whispered, her voice tight with fear. "It is probably just a branch knocking against another tree in the wind," Liam said, but there was no wind. The air around them was perfectly still, heavy and stagnant. "That is not a branch," Ben said, his eyes scanning the impenetrable gloom between the trees. "It is too regular." Click. It sounded closer now, and it was moving. It was pacing them, keeping a steady distance, a hidden observer tracking their progress. Liam, determined to find a rational explanation, pushed on. "Come on, let us keep moving. Whatever it is probably just some animal we are disturbing." But his voice was edged with a tension that betrayed his calm words. They started walking again, faster this time. The clicking sound kept pace with them, a relentless, unnerving metronome. Every snap of a twig under their boots, every rustle of a leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through Chloe. She could not shake the image of the tall, thin figure from her mind. Was that what was out there, stalking them through the trees, making that horrible sound? The path began to climb, and the woods grew denser. The air grew colder. The sense of being watched intensified until it was a tangible pressure against Chloe's skin. She could feel unseen eyes on her back, following her every move. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but saw nothing but the endless, repeating pattern of dark tree trunks. It was Ben who saw it first. He stopped dead, pointing a trembling finger off the path. "What the hell is that?" They followed his gaze. In a small, unnaturally clear patch of ground a few yards into the woods, something was hanging from the low branch of an ancient oak tree. It was a bundle of sticks and twine, crudely fashioned into the shape of a human figure, and hanging from its neck was a dead crow, its wings splayed, its head lolling at a broken angle. A wave of nausea rolled through Chloe. It was a clear, deliberate warning, a territorial marking. Liam walked cautiously towards it, his scientific curiosity battling with a growing sense of dread. "It is like a scarecrow, or some kind of effigy." As their eyes adjusted to the gloom of the clearing, they saw more. Dozens of the small, carved wooden figures they had seen at the inn were scattered on the ground around the base of the tree. They were arranged in complex, spiraling patterns, reminiscent of the symbol carved into the lintels and trees. Some were weathered and green with moss, but many were new, the freshly cut wood a stark white against the dark, loamy earth. Maya knelt, pulling out her phone to take a picture, her journalistic instincts momentarily overriding her fear. "This is a ritual site. These people are..." She trailed off as she saw what was at the very center of the spirals, a collection of bones. They were small, animal bones, by the look of them, and they had been meticulously cleaned and polished to a dull white. They were arranged with painstaking care on a bed of moss to form a large, perfect replica of the spiral eye symbol. Click. The sound was loud now, right on top of them. It seemed to be coming from all directions at once, a disorienting, terrifying chorus. It was as if the woods themselves were making the noise. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of Chloe's composure. "Liam, we have to go back. Now, just a second," he said, his voice hushed with a strange mixture of fascination and horror. He was examining the carvings on the tree trunk. "This is incredible. These markings, they are not just random, they are systematic." A sudden, sharp movement in the periphery of her vision made Chloe cry out. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. "Something moved. Over there." She pointed towards a thicket of ferns. It was tall. They all stared into the thicket, but it was motionless. There was nothing there. "Chloe, there is nothing," Liam began, but he was cut off by Maya, who let out a strangled gasp. "Behind us," she shrieked, scrambling backwards and tripping over a root. They all spun around. For a split second, Chloe saw it, a flicker of motion, a shape that was too tall, too thin, its limbs moving with a fluid, unnatural grace as it melted back into the shadows between two ancient yews. It was gone before her brain could fully process what she was seeing, but the image was burned into her mind. the thing from her dream. It was real. Ben yelled, a raw, terrified sound. He started backing away, his eyes wide with panic. "It is here," he said. "It is in here with us." The clicking sound intensified, faster now, more aggressive. It was the sound of a predator closing in, the chattering of immense, unseen mandibles. Liam's scientific detachment finally shattered, replaced by pure, primal fear. He grabbed Maya's arm, pulling her to her feet. "Back to the path," he said. "Go. Now." They did not need telling twice. They turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces. The carefully laid out path was forgotten. Their only instinct was to get away from the clearing, away from the clicking, away from the fleeting, nightmarish shapes they had glimpsed in the shadows. Their retreat was a blind, panicked scramble. They stumbled over roots, slipped on mossy stones, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The clicking sound pursued them, a relentless, mocking accompaniment to their flight. It was always just behind them, just to the side of them, a constant, terrifying presence. They could feel it herding them, toying with them. A branch would sway violently in the still air. A shower of pebbles would clatter down a rock face beside them. It was everywhere and nowhere. Chloe's lungs were on fire. Her legs felt like lead. Fear gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She ran, her mind a white noise of terror. The only thought was to get out of the woods, out of the suffocating, malevolent darkness. After what felt like an eternity, they burst through the tree line, tumbling out onto the muddy track at the edge of the village. They stumbled to a halt, gasping for air, their chests heaving. They turned to look back at the woods. The clicking stopped. The instant they crossed the invisible boundary between the woods and the village, the sound vanished. The forest stood silent and brooding, giving up none of its secrets. It was as if nothing had happened. But it had happened. The four of them stood there, covered in mud and scratches, their faces pale with shock. The shared terror was a tangible thing between them. There were no more jokes, no more attempts at rational explanation. From across the small village green, the old man on the bench watched them. He had stopped his whittling. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on them, and in his dark, unreadable eyes, Chloe saw a flicker of something ancient and knowing. It was not surprise. It was not concern. It looked, she thought with a fresh wave of horror, like satisfaction. They stumbled back to the inn, their legs unsteady. They did not speak. There were no words for what they had just experienced. Liam fumbled with the key, his hands shaking too much to fit it in the lock. Maya finally took it from him and opened the door. They hurried inside, slamming it shut behind them, as if they could shut out the entire valley. They leaned against the door, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling. The cozy warmth of a weekend getaway had been stripped away, revealing the raw, terrifying truth of the place. They were not welcome here. They were prey. As they stood there in the dusty, silent hallway of the inn, they knew with a certainty that chilled them to the bone that the nightmare had only just begun. For a long time nobody moved. They stood huddled just inside the door of the inn, a tableau of fear, their chests still heaving, the cold damp air they had dragged in with them swirling around their ankles. The silence of the inn was a physical presence pressing in on them, a stark contrast to the panicked cacophony of their flight. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the frantic, syncopated drumming of 4 terrified hearts. What was that? Ben finally managed to say, his voice a raw, scraped whisper. He slid down the wall to sit on the floor, his face pale and clammy, his eyes wide and unfocused. In the woods, what the hell was that thing? No one had an answer. The fleeting image was seared into all their minds, the unnatural height, the fluid, boneless movement, the chilling sense that it was not a creature of any known biology. Liam, the man of logic and reason, was shaking. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, his gaze darting around the dusty, shadow-filled entryway, as if expecting the thing to materialize from the gloom. His scientific framework, the lens through which he viewed the entire world, had been shattered. Rocks and strata and geological time had no explanation for what they had just seen. "We are leaving," he said, his voice hard, brittle. It was not a suggestion. It was a desperate, non-negotiable command. "Right now, pack your bags. We are getting in the car, and we are driving until we find a place with streetlights and police cars, and people who look at you when you speak to them." The decision was a spark of hope in the suffocating darkness of their fear. It was action. It was a plan. It was an escape. A surge of frantic energy propelled them into motion. They scrambled up the creaking staircase, not bothering to speak, each lost in their own terrified thoughts. In the rooms, they threw their belongings into their bags with clumsy, shaking hands. Clothes were stuffed in without being folded, toiletries forgotten on the wash basin. The only goal was speed. Every second spent in this place felt like a second stolen from the rest of their lives. Chloe grabbed her jacket, her eyes falling on the small, multi-winged bird carving on the windowsill. The sight of it made a fresh wave of revulsion and fear wash over her. She snatched the curtain, wrapping it around the wooden figurine and throwing it deep into her duffel bag. A sudden, inexplicable urge to take it with them, to remove it from this place. Within 5 minutes, they were thundering back down the stairs, their bags slung over their shoulders. They did not see Mrs. Henge. The inn was as silent and still as a tomb. Liam did not even bother to close the door behind them as they burst back out into the oppressive grey light of the village. The car sat where they had left it, a familiar silver shape in this alien landscape. It was a symbol of their world, of technology, of escape. They threw their bags onto the back seat and piled in, slamming the doors shut. The sound echoed unnervingly in the silent street. "Okay," Liam breathed, fumbling to put the key in the ignition. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 attempts. "Okay, here we go." He turned the key. Nothing happened. There was no familiar rumble of the engine catching, no whirring of the starter motor, no click of the electrics. There was nothing. Just the dead, metallic sound of the key turning in the ignition. "What?" Liam's voice was a knot of confusion and rising panic. He turned the key again, and again. The result was the same. Absolute, total silence. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel. A sharp, angry sound that seemed to be swallowed by the heavy air. "Try the lights," Maya said from the back, her voice tight. Liam flicked the headlight switch. Nothing. He tried the horn. Silence. The radio. Dead. "It is the battery," Ben said, though his tone lacked any conviction. "The battery must be dead." "It cannot be," Liam retorted, his voice rising in frustration. "It is a new car. I just had it serviced. There is no reason for the battery to be dead. Nothing was left on." He popped the hood, and they all climbed out of the car, their brief flicker of hope already extinguished, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. Liam stared down at the engine, a complex but familiar landscape of wires and metal. To Chloe, it looked like the inert corpse of some great metal beast. Everything appeared normal. The battery terminals were clean and secure. There were no obvious signs of damage, no cut wires, no leaks. "I do not understand," Liam muttered, his geological hammer still tucked into his belt, a useless tool from a world that no longer made sense. "It is like the car has no power at all, not just a dead battery. It is like it has been drained." They stood there for a moment, staring at the dead engine, the terrible truth of their situation settling upon them. They were trapped. The car, their one and only link to the outside world, their sole means of escape, was a useless hunk of metal. As they stood there in the silent street, Chloe felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them again. The curtain of a nearby cottage twitched. The whittling man on the bench had paused, his knife still, his head tilted slightly as he watched them. The village knew. The village was watching their hope die. "There has to be a mechanic," Maya said, her voice betraying a desperate attempt to cling to logic. "Or a phone." "Someone must have a landline." "Mrs. Henge," Liam said, his jaw tight with a grim resolve. He slammed the car hood shut, the sound a final, definitive pronouncement of its death. "She has to know something." They turned and walked back to the inn, their steps heavy, their shoulders slumped in defeat. The inn's front door, which they had left open, was now closed. Liam pushed it open and they stepped back into the gloom. "Mrs. Henge," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. There was no reply. They found her in the kitchen at the back of the inn. It was a dark, cramped room that smelled of boiled vegetables and damp stone. She was standing at a thick wooden table, a large, sharp-looking knife in her hand, methodically peeling a potato, the brown skin falling away in a single long spiral. She did not look up as they entered. "Our car will not start," Liam said, getting straight to the point. "The battery is completely dead. We need to call a garage. Do you have a phone we can use?" Mrs. Henge continued her task, the knife moving with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "No phone in Skarfall," she said, her voice a dry rustle. "Not for a long time." "No phone," Ben exclaimed. "How is that even possible? What do you do in an emergency?" The old woman finally paused, placing the half-peeled potato down on the table. She looked at them, her dark, beady eyes moving from face to face. There was no sympathy in her gaze, no surprise, There was nothing. "We do not have emergencies," she said, the words hanging in the cold air. "Well, we have one," Liam snapped, his patience gone. "Our car is dead." "There must be someone in the village who knows about engines. A mechanic, a farmer, anyone." Mrs. Henge picked up the potato and her knife, her attention returning to her task as if they were no longer there. "Things from outside do not work well here," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "The valley does not like them. Too much noise, too much metal." Her words, so simple, so insane, struck Chloe with the force of a physical blow. She was not being evasive. She was telling them a truth from her world, not theirs. The valley did not like it, as if the land itself was a sentient entity that had reached out and smothered the life from their car. "So what are we supposed to do?" Maya demanded, her voice rising with a note of hysteria. "Just stay here forever?" Mrs. Henge looked up again, a flicker of something cold and hard in her eyes. "You should have stayed out of the woods," she said. "You were told. The silent wood has its own ways. You disturbed things. Now you must wait." "Wait for what?" Liam asked, stepping forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Wait for the valley to settle," she said, and then she turned her back on them, a clear and final dismissal. They stumbled out of the kitchen, their minds reeling. The last vestiges of the normal world had been stripped away. There was no phone, there was no mechanic, there was no help. There was only the valley and its silent, hostile inhabitants. "She is crazy," Ben whispered, but the words were a desperate prayer, a denial of the terrifying reality that was closing in on them. "They are all crazy. We have to find someone else," Maya insisted, clinging to the last shred of hope. "We cannot just give up." "Let us try the other villagers. Someone has to help us." The prospect of walking back out into that silent, watchful street was terrifying. But the alternative, sitting in the inn, waiting for night to fall, was unthinkable. They had to do something. Stepping outside again felt like stepping onto a stage. They could feel the eyes on them from every window, every doorway. They walked down the street, a tight, frightened cluster. They decided to approach the old man on the bench. He was still whittling, a small pile of wood shavings at his feet. As they drew near, Chloe saw what he was carving. It was another of the multi-winged birds, identical to the one from her room. Liam cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sounding loud and alien in the quiet. "Our car has broken down. We need help." The old man did not look up. His gnarled fingers continued their work, the sharp knife peeling away a sliver of wood. "Please," Chloe begged, her voice trembling. "We cannot get out." The man's hands stilled. He slowly, deliberately, raised his head. His eyes were a pale, milky blue, clouded with age, but they were sharp, and they held a chilling, ancient wisdom. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on Chloe for a moment. "You went walking," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "where you should not have." It was not a question. "We did not know," Liam said. "We were just hiking." The old man let out a soft, dry chuckle that held no humor. Ignorance is not a shield in Skarfall. You walked in the silent wood, you saw the Master's signs, and you did not turn back. You made a noise in his house. The Master, Maya asked, her voice hushed. The old man held up the wooden bird he was carving. He has been here longer than the stones. He was here when the valley was ice. He keeps the silence. He does not like strangers. He does not like their noise. A cold dread spread through Chloe's veins. He was talking about the creature in the woods, their god, the Master. Can you help us? Liam asked, his voice raw with desperation. Is there anything you can do? The old man looked down at his carving again, dismissing them. The Master is awake now, he rasped. You woke him. The car will not leave. Nothing leaves Skarfall until the Master is satisfied. And that was it. He would say no more. He returned to his whittling, his concentration absolute, as if they had ceased to exist. Defeated, they turned away. The truth was undeniable now. This was not just an isolated, unfriendly village. It was a cult, an entire community in service to the creature in the woods. They were not just trapped by a dead car. They were being held here. They were offerings. As they walked aimlessly, a profound sense of despair settling over them, Chloe noticed a small, derelict building set back from the main street, partially hidden by a stand of overgrown yew trees. It was a small stone chapel, its roof sagging, its single bell silent in a crumbling belfry. A morbid curiosity, a desperate need for answers, pulled her towards it. The others followed, having nowhere else to go. The wooden door groaned open on rusted hinges. Inside, the chapel was filled with a dusty, sanctified gloom. Light struggled through the grime-caked windows. The air was cold and smelled of damp stone and something else, something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. The pews were covered in thick blankets of dust, but a clear path had been trod down the central aisle to the altar, and on the altar, where a crucifix should have been, was a large, intricately carved wooden effigy of the spiral eye. It was polished and dark, clearly an object of veneration, but it was the walls that made Chloe's breath catch in her throat. The plaster was crumbling, but covering every available surface were crude charcoal drawings. They were like a child's nightmare renderings, but the subject was terrifyingly adult. The drawings depicted the history of the village and its master. There were scenes of the villagers dressed in homespun clothes bowing down before the tall, spindly figure at the edge of the woods. There were drawings of the creature walking among them in the village street, its long, featureless face turned towards the sky. In one panel it was shown standing over a collection of animal bones, the villagers leaving offerings. In another, most horrifying of all, it was depicted leaning over a bed, its long, thin fingers reaching for a sleeping child. This was no monster to be feared and placated. This was their god, their protector, their master. And the four of them, with their car and their loud jackets and their confident city voices, had trespassed in its holy place. As the afternoon light began to fade, a new, more urgent fear took hold. Night was coming, and the night belonged to the master. A sudden sound from the village street startled them out of their horrified trance. It was a scraping, rhythmic noise. Peering out of the chapel's dirty window, they saw the villagers beginning to emerge from their cottages. But they were not gathering to confront them. They were engaged in a solemn, practiced ritual. They were shuttering their windows and dragging heavy wooden bars across their doors. One by one, the cottages of Skarfall were being sealed. The message was terrifyingly clear. They were not being locked in. The villagers were. They were sealing themselves in for the night and leaving the 4 outsiders to face whatever was coming. Panic, stark and absolute, seized them. They ran from the chapel, their feet pounding on the packed earth. A wild, desperate flight back to the only shelter they had. They burst through the door of the inn just as the last of the daylight was draining from the sky, the valley sinking into a deep, starless black. Liam slammed the heavy oak door and bolted it. They were in the main room, the dark, cluttered space with the low, oppressive ceiling. They did not dare go to their rooms. They huddled together, the 4 of them, in the center of the room, as far from the windows and doors as they could get. Night fell with an unnerving finality, and with it came the silence, a silence deeper, heavier, and more menacing than any they had yet experienced. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. They waited in the suffocating darkness, their senses stretched to the breaking point. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind sighing in the chimney, was a source of fresh terror. Hours passed. Nothing happened. The silence drew out, becoming a form of psychological torture. And then, from downstairs, in the sealed, silent inn, came a sound. It was quiet at first, tentative. A single sharp noise that cut through the stillness like a shard of glass. Click. Chloe's head snapped up, her eyes wide in the darkness. Liam froze, his hand tightening on her arm. Ben let out a soft, whimpering sound. It came again, a little louder this time, from the direction of the main entryway. Click, and again, click. It was inside. The click was a drop of poison in the absolute silence of the inn. It was a sound that did not belong, a sharp, cold violation of the dark. For a heartbeat, all 4 of them were statues carved from ice, their muscles locked, their breath held captive in their lungs. The sound had been faint, but it was undeniably inside. Downstairs. Click. It came again, louder this time, followed by the soft, dry skitter of something moving across the dusty floorboards of the main room below. It was not the heavy tread of a person. It was light, precise, and utterly alien. "It is in the house," Ben whispered, his voice cracking, the sound a fragile, pathetic thing in the vast, listening darkness. Liam's hand clamped down on Chloe's shoulder, a gesture meant to be reassuring, but that only communicated his own profound terror. His face was a pale, grim mask in the gloom. The last of his rational world had been stripped away in the woods. Now, the last of his perceived safety was being invaded. Upstairs, he mouthed, the word, a puff of air. Now, quietly. The plan was simple, born of pure animal instinct. Get to higher ground, find a room, barricade the door, pray. Moving felt impossible. Their bodies were screaming at them to stay frozen, to make no sound, to become one with the shadows. But the clicking from downstairs was a relentless prod, urging them into motion. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Liam took a single, agonizingly slow step towards the staircase. The floorboard under his foot let out a low, mournful groan that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. Below them, the clicking stopped. They froze again, every nerve ending screaming. The silence that followed was a new kind of terror. It was an active, listening silence. The thing downstairs had heard them. It knew they were there. It knew where they were. For what felt like a lifetime, the inn was as still as the grave. Then, from the base of the stairs, came a new sound. A soft, wet, dragging noise. It was moving towards them. Panic shattered their paralysis. Liam's command for quiet was forgotten, incinerated by a blaze of pure terror. They scrambled for the stairs, a clumsy, thudding cascade of footsteps. They took the steps 2 at a time, their hands slapping against the rough wooden wall for balance, their gasps for air loud and ragged in the confined space. They reached the upstairs landing, a small, dark square of space with doors leading to their 2 rooms. Which one? Maya hissed, her eyes wild. Mine, Liam said, fumbling for the door to the room he shared with Chloe. It is bigger. We can brace the bed against it. He shoved the door open, and they piled inside, a tangle of limbs and panicked breathing. Ben slammed the door shut, and Liam fumbled for the old iron key, ramming it into the lock and turning it. The heavy clunk of the bolt sliding home offered a sliver of comfort, a single defiant sound against the encroaching horror. Click. The sound was on the stairs now, a slow, deliberate ascent. It was taking its time. There was no rush. It had all night. The bed, Liam commanded, and they threw themselves at the heavy wooden bed frame. It was solid oak, immensely heavy, but adrenaline gave them a frantic, desperate strength. They shoved and grunted, the legs of the bed scraping and juddering across the floor as they pushed it against the door, wedging it tight. Next, they grabbed the heavy, squat wardrobe, its dark wood smelling of dust and age, and heaved it into place beside the bed, creating a solid wall of furniture. They fell back, gasping, their muscles trembling with exertion, their bodies slick with a cold sweat. They were trapped, barricaded in a small, dark room, their only defense a few pieces of antique furniture against a creature from a nightmare. The clicking reached the top of the stairs. It paused on the landing, just outside their door. They held their breath, listening. They could hear it moving out there, a soft, dry rustling. Chloe imagined it standing there, its long, featureless face turned towards their door, its head cocked as it listened to the frantic beating of their hearts. Then came the scratching, a light exploratory sound, like a single long nail being dragged slowly down the wood of the door. It traced the edges, the keyhole, the seams. It was examining their defenses. It was intelligent. "Oh, God," Ben whimpered, sinking to the floor and burying his face in his hands. "It is going to get in. It knows we are here." "Shut up, Ben," Liam snapped, his voice a low, vicious growl. He was standing by the barricade, his ear pressed to a crack, his entire body coiled like a spring. "Everyone just be quiet." The scratching stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. A silence that was somehow worse than the noise. "Maybe it is gone," Maya whispered, her voice laced with a desperate, fragile hope. And then the door handle began to turn. Slowly, silently, with an unnerving, fluid motion. The old iron handle rotated downwards. They stared at it, mesmerized with horror. There was a soft click as the latch disengaged. Then pressure was applied to the door. The heavy oak groaned. The bed shuddered, scraping an inch across the floor. The creature was pushing. It was not a frantic, violent assault. It was a slow, steady, relentless pressure. The pressure of something that had infinite patience and immense, unearthly strength. "Push!" Liam roared, and he and Maya threw their weight against the bed frame. Chloe and Ben scrambled to help, adding their own desperate strength to the effort. The 5 of them, 4 terrified humans, and 1 impossible creature, were locked in a silent, grim contest of strength, separated by a few inches of wood and furniture. The wood of the doorframe began to creak and splinter. The pressure was immense. Chloe could feel the vibrations through the soles of her feet, a deep, resonant power that felt ancient and unstoppable. She could smell it now, a faint, foul odor seeping through the cracks in the door. It was the smell of damp earth, of deep, dark places, of rot and cold stone. It was the smell of the grave. For minutes that stretched into an eternity they pushed. Their muscles screamed in protest, their lungs burned, but they held on, their survival dependent on this single, desperate act. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure ceased. The creature had stopped pushing. They collapsed against the furniture, their legs weak, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. They listened, their ears straining against the wood. There was no sound from the landing, no clicking, no scratching, nothing. "It is gone," Maya gasped, her voice raw. "It gave up." But Liam shook his head, his eyes wide with a dawning, more profound horror. "No," he breathed. "It is not gone. It is just thinking." He was right. It had not given up. It had simply been testing them, learning. And now it was trying something new. A sound from the wall to their right made them all flinch. A faint, scraping noise. It was coming from inside the wall. Chloe stared at the floral patterned peeling wallpaper, her mind refusing to process what she was hearing. The sound moved upwards, a dry, rasping progress. It was climbing the outside of the inn. "The window," Chloe whispered, the words like shards of glass in her throat. They all turned to look at the single small window. It was covered by a thin moth-eaten curtain, and beyond it lay only the impenetrable blackness of the Skarfall night. It seemed an impossible thought. They were on the second floor, but the scraping sound was getting closer, moving horizontally now, just outside. Liam, moving with a strange, dreamlike slowness, crept towards the window. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the thin fabric of the curtain. "Do not," Maya pleaded, her voice a choked sob. "Liam, do not look." But he had to. They all had to. The not knowing was a greater torture than whatever horror lay on the other side. He pulled the curtain back. For a moment, all they saw was their own terrified faces reflected in the dark glass. Then a shape resolved itself from the blackness beyond. A face, a pale, bone-white and utterly featureless oval, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. It was pressed flat against the glass, distorting slightly, like a mask made of wet clay. It was looking in. A collective scream was ripped from their throats, a raw, primal sound of absolute terror. Ben scrambled backwards, Crab walking across the floor, his face a mask of insanity. Maya simply stood, her hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes fixed on the horror at the window. And then a hand came into view, a long, impossibly thin limb, pale white like the face, with an extra joint in the arm. It ended in 3 long, spidery fingers, each tipped with a shard of what looked like black polished obsidian. One of the fingers tapped lightly on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. It was a delicate, almost curious sound, an intelligent sound. It was an invitation. The old, warped window frame began to creak and groan. The glass bowed inwards, hairline fractures spreading from the point where the face was pressed against it. The thing was putting pressure on it, its immense silent strength focused now on this new, weaker point of entry. They were going to die. In this small, dark room, in this forgotten corner of the world, this thing was going to get in and it was going to kill them. The thought was a cold, stark certainty. It was in that moment of absolute despair that Chloe's hand, scrabbling for purchase against the wall, brushed against a loose piece of wood on the wardrobe they had shoved against the door. A small, carved panel. Her fingers traced it in the darkness. It was the spiral eye symbol. A surge of desperate, irrational impulse shot through her. "The carving," she yelled, her voice high and shrill. "The bird." "What are you talking about?" Liam yelled back, his eyes still locked on the fracturing window. From the windowsill, the wooden bird. "I took it," she shrieked, scrambling for her duffel bag, which lay half-crushed near the barricade. She tore it open, her hands plunging inside, feeling for the curtain-wrapped object. Her fingers closed around it. It felt cold, ancient. She pulled it out, ripping away the curtain. The small, dark, multi-winged bird sat in her palm. The wood was smooth, almost oily to the touch. The whittler on the bench, the ritual site in the woods, the symbols everywhere. They were not just warnings, they were part of the ritual. "What do we do with it?" Maya cried, as a spiderweb of cracks spread across the window pane. Chloe did not know. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and instinct. She looked at the bird, then at the horrifying blank face at the window. An offering. The old man's words echoed in her head. The master is awake now. Nothing leaves Skarfall until the master is satisfied. They had disturbed it. They had made a noise in its house. They owed it a tribute. They owed it silence. With a strangled sob, Chloe lurched forward. Liam grabbed for her but missed. She ran to the window, her mind screaming, her body acting on a primal, desperate logic. The blank face was still there, a foot away from her, separated only by a thin, cracking sheet of glass. She held up the small, carved bird, and then with all her strength she threw it, not at the face, but through the window. The glass shattered with a deafening explosion, imploding outwards into the night. Cold, damp air rushed into the room, carrying the foul, earthy smell of the creature. For a split second, through the jagged hole in the window, Chloe saw the thing recoil, the pale, featureless face pulled back into the darkness. She saw the impossibly long, thin neck and the narrow, hunched shoulders. Then it was gone. The scraping sound stopped. The pressure on the window ceased. Silence. They stood there, breathing in ragged, painful gulps of the cold night air and staring at the shattered window. Shards of glass littered the floor around Chloe's feet. Beyond the broken pane, there was only the deep, impenetrable black of the valley. It was gone, for now. The silence that followed the explosion of glass was different. It was not the listening, predatory silence from before. This was a hollow, ringing emptiness, filled with the whisper of the night wind rushing through the broken window. Shards of glass glittered like black diamonds on the floorboards. The cold was a living thing, pouring into the room, raising goosebumps on their flesh and chilling the sweat on their skin. For a full minute they were frozen, staring at the jagged hole that opened into the absolute blackness of the valley. It was an open wound in their sanctuary. The creature was gone, but it had left its mark. "It is gone," Ben stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He was still on the floor, his arms wrapped around his knees, rocking back and forth like a child. Chloe was trembling so violently she could barely stand. Her hand was empty, the ghost of the carved bird still tingling in her palm. The act had been pure, unthinking instinct, a desperate prayer thrown into the void, and the void had answered. She looked at the shattered window, at the darkness beyond, and understood with a terrifying certainty that she had just participated in a conversation she did not understand. She had given it something it wanted. "We can't stay here," Maya said, her voice a sharp, pragmatic blade cutting through their shock. She gestured at the broken window with a shaking hand. "This room isn't safe anymore. It can get back in." Liam, who had been staring at Chloe with a mixture of awe and terror, snapped back into action. "She's right. The other room." Now, the thought of leaving the relative safety of their barricade was horrifying. The landing was out there. The stairs. The dark, silent inn where the creature had just been walking. But the wind whistling through the broken glass was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. "Unbar the door," Liam ordered, his voice taking on a strained, forceful tone. He was fighting to be the leader again, to impose order on a situation that had descended into primordial chaos. Pushing the heavy furniture away from the door felt like an act of profound surrender. Each inch they moved it, they expected to hear the clicking again, to feel the pressure on the other side. But there was nothing, only the groaning of the heavy furniture and their own ragged breathing. Liam put his hand on the key. He looked at the others, his eyes dark and wide in the gloom. Ready? They nodded, a trio of terrified faces. He turned the key and pulled the door inward. The landing was empty. A deep, impenetrable darkness pooled at the top of the stairs. Every shadow seemed to hold a hint of impossible height, of unnatural thinness. Go, Liam whispered, and they moved. It was not a run, but a swift, silent, desperate shuffle across the few feet of landing that separated the two rooms. Their bare feet made soft, pattering sounds on the dusty floorboards. They piled into Ben and Maya's room, a smaller, more cramped space, and Ben, who was closest, slammed the door shut. The sound was a small, pathetic bang in the immense silence. Liam locked it, and without a word, they heaved the room's single, smaller wardrobe in front of it. It felt like a futile gesture. They knew now that a wooden door and a piece of furniture were no real defense. They were simply markers, a line drawn in the sand that the creature could cross whenever it chose. Their survival so far felt less like a victory and more like a temporary, capricious reprieve. They huddled together in the darkness, on the far side of the room, their backs against the cold exterior wall. The long, agonizing vigil began. No one spoke. Words were useless. They were a liability, a noise that could draw the attention of the thing that hunted them. So they sat in silence, a knot of shared terror, and listened. Every sound from the old inn was magnified, twisted by their fear into a new threat. The sigh of the wind in the eaves, the groan of a floorboard settling, the distant, lonely hoot of an owl, which sounded for all the world like a mocking imitation of a human voice. They listened for the one sound they dreaded above all others, the cold, sharp, deliberate click. But it did not come. As the hours crawled by, the initial, frantic spike of adrenaline gave way to a deep, bone-grinding exhaustion. Fear was a physical weight, pressing down on them, crushing the air from their lungs. Chloe found her mind drifting into a strange, detached state. She kept seeing the featureless face, the three-fingered hand, the spiral eye carved into the lintel of the inn. They were not random images of horror. They were a language, a set of symbols, and the carved bird had been a single, desperate word in that language. "Leave us alone." She looked at the others, their silhouettes barely visible in the gloom. Liam sat ramrod straight, his jaw clenched, a man of science clinging to the wreckage of his worldview. Maya was a tight, coiled spring of tension, her reporter's mind trying to find a pattern, a logic, a story in the madness. And Ben was broken. He was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking with a grief that went beyond fear. He was mourning the death of the world he had known, a world where monsters were not real. Sometime in the deepest, darkest darkest hour of the night, when hope had withered to a single dying ember, Liam's voice cut through the silence, a rough, painful whisper. "Chloe." She looked at him. "How did you know?" he asked, the words scraped from his throat. "About the bird. How did you know that would work?" She shook her head, the movement barely perceptible in the dark. "I did not," she whispered back. "I just felt it. It was an offering. That is what they do. The villagers, they leave things, the carvings, the bones in the woods. They are giving things to it, to keep it happy, to keep it quiet. Quiet." Maya breathed from the darkness, the silent wood, the silence of Skarfall. "It is not about sound." "No," Chloe said, the idea taking shape in her mind, a piece of terrible, intuitive logic. "It is about balance, a state of being. We came here with our car, our phones, our noise. We are loud, not just our voices, our existence. We do not belong." We broke the silence. A profound, chilling understanding settled over them. They were a discordant note in an ancient, fragile symphony, and the conductor was trying to remove them. They fell silent again, the weight of this new understanding a heavier burden than the fear itself. They were not just random victims of a monster. They were heretics in a church they had not known existed. Dawn came not with a blaze of hopeful light, but with a slow, reluctant dilution of the darkness. A miserable, grey twilight seeped into the room, revealing their pale, haggard faces, the dark circles under their eyes, the stark terror that had become their only reality. With the light came a new sound, a sound from downstairs, a bolt being drawn, the creak of the inn's front door, then the soft, mundane sounds of someone moving about. The scrape of a chair, the clink of pottery. It was Mrs. Henge. She was starting her day as if nothing had happened, as if the house had not been besieged by a creature from the dawn of time. The sheer, insane normality of it was more jarring than the horror of the night. It was a clear, unambiguous message. The night was over. The master had retreated, and the rules of the day were back in effect. For a long time, they did not move. But hunger, thirst, and the desperate human need for answers were powerful motivators. Finally, Liam stood up, his joints cracking. "We have to go down," he said, his voice a dead, emotionless thing. "We have to face them." There were no arguments. There was nowhere else to go. Moving the wardrobe felt different in the grey light of morning. It was just a piece of furniture again. The landing was just a landing. But the fear was still there, a permanent stain on the air. They crept down the stairs, each step a conscious, deliberate act. They found Mrs. Henge in the kitchen, just as they had the day before. She was standing at the same wooden table, a knife in her hand, a pile of root vegetables in front of her. The old whittler from the bench was there too, sitting silently in a corner chair, a new block of wood and his knife in his hands. He did not look up. Mrs. Henge turned as they entered, her black, beady eyes sweeping over them. She took in their dishevelled clothes, their pale faces, their haunted eyes. Her expression was, as ever, a complete unreadable blank. "Breakfast is porridge," she stated, and turned back to her vegetables. The statement was so profoundly, surreally mundane that it broke something in Liam. He lunged forward, stopping just short of the table, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. "We are not eating porridge," he roared, his voice cracking with a day's worth of repressed terror and rage. "You are going to tell us what is going on. What was that thing? What does it want from us?" The old man in the corner paused his whittling. Mrs. Henge slowly placed her knife on the table. She turned to face Liam, her gaze as cold and hard as the Skarfall stone. "You were told to stay out of the wood," she said, her voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "That thing was in the house," Maya cried, her voice rising. "It tried to get into our room. It broke a window." Mrs. Henge's gaze shifted to Chloe. A flicker of something not surprise but a cold, clinical interest passed through her eyes. "You gave the master a gift," she said. "It was not a question. A gift." Ben whimpered. "It tried to kill us." "The master does not kill," the old man said from his corner, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He still had not looked up from his block of wood. "He quiets. He restores the balance. You disturbed the valley. You owe a debt." Here it was, the confrontation, not with the creature, but with its keepers, its priests. "What debt?" Liam demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "We did not do anything." "You exist," the old man said simply, as if this was the most obvious and damning crime of all. He finally lifted his head, and his pale, milky eyes fixed on them. "You are loud. The master heard your car on the high road. He felt your iron and your noise enter his valley. He watched you walk in his wood. You made a sound in a silent place. Now the silence must be restored. Within you, a cold, paralytic dread, worse than anything they had felt during the night, began to creep up Chloe's spine. This was not about escape. This was about conversion. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "The master takes what is owed," Mrs. Henge said, her voice flat. "He will take your noise. He will take the parts of you that do not belong in Skarfall, so that you may be quiet, like us." And Chloe finally understood. She looked at the two villagers, at their blank, emotionless faces, their slow, deliberate movements. She thought of the other villagers, sitting silently in their cottages, their gazes empty. They were not just quiet, they were hollow. Parts of them were missing. "What does he take?" Liam asked, his voice barely audible. The old man held up the piece of wood he was working on. With a few deft, precise cuts, he finished his work. It was another of the multi-winged birds. "He takes what is offered," the whittler said, his pale eyes distant, as if looking into a memory. "Or he takes what he needs. A loud memory, a hopeful dream, a shadow that runs too fast. He will take it, and you will be lighter. You will be silent. You will be at peace." The true nature of their prison was finally, horribly clear. The creature was not a simple predator. It was a psychic parasite, a farmer that harvested the very essence of what made them human, and the villagers were its willing, hollowed-out livestock. "You are insane," Liam breathed, taking a step back. "You are all insane." Mrs. Henge picked up her knife. "The master was satisfied with the gift," she said, her tone suggesting the matter was now closed. For now. But the debt is not paid. Tonight he will come again, and he will want more than a wooden bird. She looked directly at them, her black eyes like pinpricks in her pale, wrinkled face. There was no menace in her expression, just a calm, terrible, absolute certainty. Tonight, she said, you will make a proper offering. Mrs. Henge's final words hung in the cold kitchen air like a death sentence. Tonight, you will make a proper offering. No one moved. No one breathed. The four of them stood rooted to the spot, staring at the two villagers. Mrs. Henge had already turned her back on them, her attention returning to the pile of muddy vegetables on the table as if she had just commented on the weather. The old man was hunched over his block of wood again, his knife moving in slow, rhythmic strokes. The conversation, as far as they were concerned, was over. The spell broke. Liam took a stumbling step backward, then another, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He turned and fled the kitchen. The others followed, a silent, stumbling retreat. They did not run, but walked with the heavy, shuffling steps of the condemned, their minds reeling, their bodies numb. They went back up the creaking staircase, a journey that now felt horribly familiar. The upstairs landing, with its two doors, felt like a cage. They retreated to the room with the intact window, the one they had barricaded themselves in for most of the night. Liam pushed the door shut, and the soft click of the latch was a sound of finality. They were entombed. For a long time, they just stood there in the miserable grey light, scattered around the small room, lost in their own private hells. The concept of a proper offering was a virus that had infected their minds, a piece of impossible, Lovecraftian logic that their 21st century brains could not pass. "This is a nightmare," Ben whispered, his voice hoarse. He slid down the wall, his legs no longer able to support him, and buried his face in his hands. "I am going to wake up. This is not real." But it was real. The cold in the room was real. The memory of the featureless face at the window was real. The hollow, dead look in the villager's eyes was real. Liam began to pace, a caged, frantic energy radiating from him. He moved from the door to the window and back again, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was a man of rocks and pressures, of tangible, measurable forces. This thing, this psychic vampire, was an insult to the very laws of his universe. "No," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "No. I am not going to sit here and wait for that thing to come and scoop a piece of my brain out. We are not making any offerings. We fight." "Fight with what, Liam?" Maya shot back, her voice sharp with afraid, terrified sarcasm. "Your geological hammer? Are you going to chip a rock at it? Did you not see what it did to the door? Did you not feel its strength? It is better than just kneeling down and letting it happen." He roared, whirling to face her. "What is your plan, Maya? Take notes for the article you will never get to write. How I offered up my childhood memory of a puppy to appease the local boogeyman." The cruelty of his words hung in the air. Maya flinched as if struck, her face pale. "I am trying to think," she retorted, her voice trembling. I am trying to understand the rules. This is not a wild animal. It is intelligent. There is a system here, a ritual. An offering is a transaction. If we can figure out the currency, maybe we can survive. The currency is us, Liam yelled, gesturing wildly around the room. It is our minds, our souls. There is no negotiating that away. What if there is? Chloe's voice, quiet and trembling, cut through their argument. They both turned to look at her. She was standing by the window, looking out at the oppressive grey sky that pressed down on the valley. What if it is a choice? She continued, her voice barely a whisper. The old man said, "It takes what is offered, or it takes what it needs. That is a choice. Maybe, if we choose what to give it, we can control it. We can give it something we can afford to lose." The room fell silent. The sheer, insane logic of her words was terrifying. To willingly choose a piece of your own mind to be consumed by a monster. To perform a psychic self-amputation to save the whole. Afford to lose, Ben sobbed from the floor. What memory can you afford to lose? The day you graduated, your first kiss, your mother's face. Each question was a fresh wave of grief. He was right. Every memory, every hope, was a thread in the tapestry of who they were. To pull one out was to unravel the whole. "It is better than it taking something at random," Chloe insisted, turning to face them, her eyes wide with a desperate, fearful conviction. "He said it takes loud things, hopeful dreams. We are all terrified right now. What if it just comes in and takes our hope? All of it. What would be left of us then? We would be like them, the villagers, empty." They all pictured the blank, placid faces of the people of Skarfall, the peace of the hollow, the silence of the void, and in that moment they understood that there were fates worse than death. Liam stopped pacing. He stared at Chloe, his anger deflating, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The logic of the nightmare was beginning to infect him too. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice raw. "Sit in a circle and think about a happy memory really hard, and hope the monster eats that one, and not the one where we learned how to walk." His sarcasm was a thin shield, and it was failing. "I think that is exactly what we do," Chloe said, her voice shaking but firm. "I am an artist. My work is all memory and emotion. I take a feeling, a moment, a piece of myself, and I focus on it so hard that I can put it on a canvas. It is an act of will, an act of transference. Maybe that is what this is. We have to choose something. Something loud, something bright, something it would want. And we offer it, willingly." The day wore on. The miserable grey light outside never changed, leaving them in a timeless, claustrophobic limbo. They did not eat. They did not drink. They sat in the small, cold room and they talked. They engaged in the most horrifying debate of their lives. What piece of a soul was disposable? Maya, the pragmatist, tried to approach it logically. "It has to be something significant," she argued, her voice low and clinical, a desperate attempt to maintain intellectual distance, something with emotional weight. It feeds on the loudness, remember. Offering it the memory of what I had for breakfast last Tuesday will not work. It would be an insult. It would just take what it wanted anyway. Ben was inconsolable. He could not engage. He just rocked back and forth, muttering, "I cannot, I cannot, I cannot." Liam fought it. He paced. He examined the window, the floorboards, the walls, searching for a physical weakness, a structural flaw in their metaphysical prison. He still had his hammer tucked into his belt, a useless talisman of a world that no longer existed. At one point he found a heavy iron poker leaning against the small, unused fireplace in the corner of the room. He picked it up, weighing it in his hand. "When it comes," he said, his eyes burning with a feverish, hopeless defiance, "I am going to be standing by the door, and I am going to hit it. And then it will take everything from you, Liam," Chloe said softly. "Do not you see? That is the noise it wants. Rage, defiance, that is a feast for it." He stared at the poker, and then let it drop to the floor with a loud clang that made them all jump. He sank onto the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. The fight was gone. The true horror of their situation was not just the creature, it was the choice it was forcing them to make. They had to turn inwards, to dissect their own minds and their own histories, searching for a worthy sacrifice. They spoke of memories they had never shared with anyone, laying the most intimate parts of themselves bare in the desperate hope of finding something they could bear to part with. It was a harrowing and painful process, a violation far more intimate than any physical threat. As the afternoon began to fade, a decision was reached, born not of consensus, but of exhaustion and utter desperation. They could not sacrifice one person for the good of the group. The guilt would destroy the survivors. They could not each offer up a small, insignificant memory. It would not be enough to satisfy the creature. The plan, proposed by Maya in a voice devoid of all emotion, was as logical as it was monstrous. They had to offer up a shared memory, a single, powerful, emotionally charged memory that they all possessed, a memory that was foundational to their friendship. If they all focused on the same event from their own perspectives, it would create a single, overwhelmingly loud offering, a beacon in the psychic darkness. They all knew which memory it had to be. The trip to Yosemite 3 years ago. It was the moment their friendship had solidified, the moment they had gone from being 4 separate people to a single, cohesive unit. They remembered the drive, singing off-key to the radio. They remembered the grueling hike up to Glacier Point, Ben complaining the whole way until they reached the summit. They remembered the view, the vast, breathtaking expanse of the valley, half-dome bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. They remembered the feeling of awe, of shared accomplishment, of a friendship that felt as solid and eternal as the granite cliffs around them. It was a perfect, shining memory. It was a loud memory. It was a hopeful memory. The thought of giving it up, of willingly carving that moment out of their minds, was an agony beyond words. It was the foundation of their bond. To lose it would be to lose a part of what made them them. They would still know they were friends, but the emotional bedrock, the why, would be gone. They would be left with a scar, a hollow space where that perfect golden day used to be. As the last of the miserable light drained from the sky, they heard the sounds from the village begin, the scrape of bolts being thrown, the thud of heavy shutters being closed. The villagers were sealing themselves in for the night. The ticking clock had run out. "It is time," Maya said, her voice a dead thing. Without a word, they moved the wardrobe back in front of the door. It was a futile gesture, but the ritual of it was a small comfort. There would be no fight this time, no resistance, only a terrible, willing submission. They sat on the floor in a circle, their backs to the walls, facing each other in the deepening gloom. "We all have to do it," Chloe said, her voice shaking. "If one of us does not, it will not work. It will know." Ben was still crying, but he nodded, his face a mess of tears and snot. Liam's face was grim, set like stone. Maya's was a blank, controlled mask. "Close your eyes," Chloe whispered. "And remember everything. The smell of the pine trees, the warmth of the sun, the way the light hit the mountain. Remember how you felt. Hold it in your mind. Make it as bright and as loud as you can. We have to make it the most tempting thing in the world. We have to feed the silence." They closed their eyes. The darkness behind their eyelids was absolute. Chloe took a deep, shuddering breath and cast her mind back 3 years, searching for the warmth, for the light, for the memory of a friendship that felt like it could move mountains. She found it, a glowing ember in the terrified darkness of her mind. She focused on it, nurtured it, made it burn brighter. And as the 4 of them sat in silent mental communion, performing a desperate act of psychic surgery on themselves, a sound came from downstairs. It was quiet, precise, and utterly inevitable. Click. The click was the sound of a key turning in a lock deep within their minds. It was the sound of the inevitable. They did not open their eyes. To see what was coming would be to break the fragile, terrified concentration that was their only shield and their only offering. Click. It was on the stairs now. A slow, measured ascent. There was no attempt at stealth. Stealth was for hunters who feared their prey could escape. This was the confident, unhurried approach of a farmer entering a pen. They could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, a subtle thrum that resonated not in their bones, but in the deepest, most primitive parts of their brains. They held the memory of Yosemite in their minds, a single shared point of light in the encroaching darkness. Chloe saw Liam laughing, the sun catching the lines around his eyes. She felt the rough granite under her hands as she pulled herself up the last few feet of the trail. She smelled the sharp, clean scent of pine and cold stone. She forced the feelings to the surface. Joy, triumph, the profound, unspoken love of a chosen family. It was a beacon. Here, her mind screamed into the silence. Here is the loudest thing we have. Take it. The clicking stopped. It was outside the door, on the landing. The small space just beyond the wood became the center of the universe. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with a sudden suffocating pressure. It felt like being at the bottom of a deep, cold ocean. The silence pressed in on them, a physical weight that made their eardrums ache. There was no scratching this time, no testing of the lock. The barricade of furniture was an irrelevance. A low, resonant hum began to permeate the room, a sound that was felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to make the very atoms in the air shudder. The shadow beneath the door, a thin black line in the gloom, began to darken, to thicken. It was not a shadow cast by a light, it was an absence of light, an active, hungry patch of non-existence. The shadow elongated, stretching into the room like a tendril of black ink dropped into water. It flowed across the floorboards, silent, unnaturally fluid. It was not a body. It was a presence. It was a will. The tendril of darkness touched the circle they had formed, and a jolt of arctic cold shot through them. It was a shock of pure violation. Chloe gasped, her eyes flying open against her will. She saw nothing but the gloom of the room, but she could feel it. It was inside their circle. It was inside their heads. The connection was made. The memory of Yosemite, which she had been holding so carefully, was suddenly no longer hers. A cold, alien consciousness was touching it, examining it with a detached, ancient curiosity. She felt hooks, impossibly sharp and cold, sink into the memory. It was being pulled. A scream lodged in her throat. The pain was not physical. It was an agony of the soul, a spiritual tearing. The golden light of that perfect sunset began to dim, tainted by a creeping grey. The faces of her friends, once so full of life and laughter, began to distort. Liam's smile became a grotesque, mocking sneer. Maya's triumphant gaze turned into a cold, judgmental stare. The feeling of love and connection curdled into a sickening dread. The creature was not just taking the memory, it was poisoning it as it took it, feeding on the emotional energy, the loudness, as it soured. She could feel the others experiencing the same thing. Liam grunted, a low guttural sound of pain, his body tensing as if resisting a physical blow. Maya let out a soft, choked whimper, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. They were all holding on, giving the thing what it wanted, enduring the psychic evisceration. But Ben was screaming. It was not a loud, defiant scream. It was a high, thin, keening wail of pure, unadulterated terror. He had broken the circle. His eyes were wide open, staring at a point in the center of the room that only he could see, and what he saw there had shattered his mind. He was no longer offering the memory. He was a fountain of raw, chaotic fear. His terror was a siren's song, 1,000 times louder than the carefully curated memory they had prepared. Chloe felt the hooks in her mind abruptly disengage. The pressure lessened. The creature, a being of pure, dispassionate appetite, had turned its attention from their shared meal to the banquet that was Ben's terror. Ben, no, Liam yelled, scrambling forward, but it was too late. They felt it, a profound, focused shift in the psychic pressure in the room. All of the creature's immense, silent will was now directed at one point, at Ben. It was not a quick or merciful feeding. They were spectators to a psychic massacre. They felt echoes of what Ben was experiencing, flashes of a mind being unmade. They saw his own memories being turned against him, twisted into instruments of torture. A childhood birthday party became a conclave of leering, featureless demons. His mother's loving embrace became the cold, crushing grip of the grave. Every joy, every hope, every small defining moment of his life was being systematically located, corrupted, and consumed. It was a process of erasure. The creature was not just feeding, it was cleaning. It was quieting the noise of a human soul. Ben's screams subsided into a series of wet, gulping sobs, and then into a profound, unnerving silence. He simply sat there, his back against the wall, his eyes open and staring, but utterly vacant. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose, a single, dark red line against his deathly pale skin, and then it was over. The pressure in the room vanished, the unnatural cold receded, the low hum faded into nothing, the shadow on the floor retreated, flowing back under the door like a tide going out. A final soft click echoed up from downstairs as the inn's front door was shut. The master had been fed, the debt had been paid. For a long time, the three of them, Chloe, Liam, and Maya, remained in place, frozen. The silence Ben left behind was a new and terrible thing. It was absolute. Slowly, shakily, Chloe pushed herself to her feet. Her body felt impossibly heavy, her mind foggy and strange. She looked at Liam, then at Maya. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a shared dawning horror. She felt a connection to them, a bond forged in trauma. But something was wrong, something was missing. Yosemite, she whispered, the word feeling strange and foreign in her mouth. Liam and Maya just stared at her. They understood the word as a place, a national park. But the emotional resonance was gone. It was like a word from a language they no longer spoke. They knew, factually, that they had been friends for years. They knew they had gone on a trip there. But the warmth, the light, the foundational memory that had cemented their bond was a complete and utter blank. There was a hole in their shared history, a perfectly shaped void where a perfect day used to be. They were three strangers who knew each other's names. Their gazes all turned to the figure sitting silently against the wall. Ben, Maya said, her voice a fragile, trembling thing. They crept towards him. He was still sitting upright, his posture unnaturally still. His chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm. He was breathing. He was alive. But his eyes were the eyes of the villagers. They were calm, placid, and utterly, terrifyingly empty. All the fear, all the anxiety, all the personality, all the noise that had been Ben was gone. What was left was a quiet, hollow shell. Liam reached out a trembling hand and touched his shoulder. Ben, man, say something. Ben turned his head slowly, his movements fluid and unhurried. He looked at Liam, his expression one of perfect, placid contentment. A faint, serene smile touched his lips. "It is so quiet now," he said, his voice a soft, gentle monotone. "It is so peaceful." He turned his gaze back to the empty space in the middle of the room, his smile never wavering. He was at peace, the peace of the void. Chloe backed away, A hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a rising scream. They had survived, but they had failed. They had tried to offer the creature a piece of themselves, and it had ended up taking all of one of them instead. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had taken their friend. They were no longer four friends fighting for survival. They were three broken survivors and a monument to their failure. The night was not yet over. They had paid a terrible price, but they knew with a certainty that chilled them to the bone that the silence of Skarfall was not yet satisfied. The dawn that followed was not a promise, but a verdict. A pale, sickly grey light crept into the room, illuminating the scene of their desecration. 3 survivors and a ghost sat in the wreckage of the night. Ben had not moved. He remained propped against the wall, his hands resting limply in his lap, a serene, beatific smile on his face. He was an effigy of their failure. No one had slept. They had spent the remaining hours of darkness in a state of silent, suspended shock, watching him. They were waiting for a flicker of the old Ben to return. But nothing came. He would occasionally turn his head, his empty eyes following motes of dust in a sunbeam they could not see, his smile never faltering. He was lost to them, a ship sunk into the crushing, silent depths. The hole in their own minds was a raw, psychic wound. They knew they were friends, but the emotional memory that formed the keystone of that friendship was gone. It left them feeling hollowed out and untethered from each other. They were 3 separate, terrified individuals again, bound only by a shared trauma. It was Maya who finally broke the silence, her voice a dry, cracking whisper in the cold room. "We have to leave." It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of the most basic biological imperative: move or die. Liam, who had been staring at Ben with a look of profound, bottomless guilt, slowly nodded. The scientist in him was dead. The man of action was a ghost. All that was left was a raw, exposed nerve of fear. "He is right," he said, his voice thick. He could not bring himself to say Ben's name. "There is no other choice." They looked at Ben. The unspoken question hung between them. What do we do with him? The thought of leaving him behind was a betrayal too monstrous to contemplate, but the thought of taking him with them that was impossible. He was not their friend anymore. He was one of them. He belonged to the valley now. "We cannot," Chloe whispered, the words tasting like poison. She was giving voice to the terrible, pragmatic truth. "We cannot take him. He would not come. And even if he did, what would we be taking?" They were abandoning their friend to an eternity in a living hell that he perceived as heaven. The agony of that choice was a physical thing, a tightening in their chests. But the instinct for survival was stronger. They stood up, their limbs stiff and aching. Every movement was an effort of will. They did not look at Ben as they moved towards the door. To look at him would be to break. Liam slid the heavy wardrobe away from the door. The scraping sound loud and profane in the morning quiet. He put his hand on the doorknob and hesitated, his eyes closed. He was saying a silent goodbye. He opened the door. The landing was empty. awash in the same miserable grey light as their room. They stepped out, leaving Ben behind in his peaceful, silent world. They did not close the door. It felt too final. They crept down the stairs, each step a thunderclap in their own ears. They expected to be met with resistance, to find the villagers waiting for them. But the ground floor was silent, empty. The fire in the main hearth was dead, a pile of grey ash. The kitchen was also empty. A half-peeled potato sat on the wooden table, a testament to a morning ritual interrupted. The front door of the inn was visible from the kitchen doorway. It was closed, and a heavy iron bolt was drawn across it. Their prison. The keys, Maya breathed, her reporter's eyes scanning, assessing. They have to be here somewhere. They saw them at the same time. Hanging on a small, rusted hook next to the main door, almost invisible against the dark wood, was a single, heavy iron key. It was the key to the bolt. "Okay," Liam whispered, taking charge, a flicker of his old self returning. "Chloe, you get the key. Maya, stand by the door. The moment it is unlocked, we run. We do not stop. We get to the car and we are gone." It was a simple plan. It was a desperate plan. Chloe moved towards the hook, her feet making no sound on the stone floor. She was a ghost in a house of ghosts. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and closed them around the cold, heavy iron of the key. "You will not be leaving," the voice came from behind them, from the kitchen. Mrs. Henge stood there, a carving knife held loosely in one hand. The old whittler stood beside her, his own knife in his hand, his pale eyes fixed on them. They had not made a sound. They had simply appeared, as if they had materialized from the shadows. "The master is not finished with you," Mrs. Henge said, her voice flat, devoid of malice. It was a simple statement of fact. "The debt is not paid. You are part of the flock now. You belong to the silence." "We are not your goddamn flock," Liam snarled, his fear transmuting into a final, blazing surge of rage. He took a step forward, placing himself between the women and the villagers. "We are leaving this place." "No," the old man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "You are loud. The master requires more quiet. Tonight he will come again, and the next night, until you are at peace." In that moment, they understood. This was not a one-time event. It was a process, a slow, agonizing stripping away of their souls, night after night, until they were as empty and peaceful as Ben. That knowledge was the final spark. "Now," Liam roared. It was a sound of pure, primal defiance, a scream of rage against the dying of the light. He was not just yelling a command. He was making a noise, a loud, deliberate, glorious noise, an offering of a different kind. He lunged, not at the two villagers in front of him, but towards the fireplace, grabbing the heavy iron poker he had dropped the day before. He was a man of science facing a god, and he had chosen his weapon. It was useless, and he knew it, but it was a choice. Chloe, jolted into action by his roar, lifted the key from its hook. Maya was already at the door, her hands on the heavy iron bolt. As Chloe ran to her, she saw movement outside the grimy windows of the inn. The villagers were coming out of their cottages, moving with a slow, unhurried purpose towards the inn. They were forming a silent, placid perimeter. The entire valley was the cage. "They are everywhere," Maya gasped, her fingers fumbling with the keyhole. Liam charged. He let out another raw, guttural yell and ran straight at the old whittler. The old man, surprisingly agile, sidestepped the clumsy swing of the poker, but Liam had created the opening they needed. Chloe shoved the key into the lock. It was stiff, rusted. She put all her weight into it, her shoulder screaming in protest. It turned with a deafening, grinding shriek. Maya threw her weight against the bolt, sliding it back with a loud thud. They risked a look back. Liam was fighting. He was outnumbered. Mrs. Henge had joined the fray, and 2 more villagers had come in through the back. They were not trying to kill him. They were trying to subdue him, their movements economical and strange, like ants working together to move a much larger insect. Liam swung the poker, a wild, desperate arc of defiance keeping them at bay. His face was a mask of sweat and furious tears. He was giving them everything they wanted: rage, fear, noise. He caught Chloe's eye across the room. "Go," he screamed, the word tearing from his throat. It was his last gift to them. Tears streamed down Chloe's face as she and Maya heaved the heavy door open. The cold morning air hit them like a physical blow. It was the air of the real world, the air of freedom. They ran. They sprinted across the dead grass of the yard, their lungs burning. The car was there, a beautiful mundane chariot of salvation. But as they got closer, the hope that had flared in their chests died a sudden, brutal death. All 4 tires were slashed. Long, deep gashes had been cut into the rubber. The car sagged on its rims, utterly immobile. They stopped, panting, their breath pluming in the cold air. They were 20 feet from the car, 20 feet from a useless piece of metal. They slowly turned and looked back at the inn. The villagers were emerging. They were not running. They were walking. Mrs. Henge and the old whittler stood in the doorway, their expressions unchanged. And between them, supported by 2 other men, was Liam. He was no longer fighting. His head was bowed, his body limp. The fire had gone out of him, and behind them, framed in the doorway, stood Ben, his serene smile fixed in place, as if welcoming his friend into the fold. They were all there, the quiet flock, and they were all looking at Chloe and Maya. There was no hatred in their eyes, no anger. There was only a calm, patient, all-encompassing certainty. You belong to us. You belong to the silence. There was nowhere to run. The woods were a tangled, impassable trap. The high road was miles away. The valley held them in its stony embrace. Maya's shoulders slumped. The fighter in her, the reporter who always looked for an angle, a way out, finally gave up. Her mind, which had been racing for 2 days, simply stopped. A profound, exhausted quiet fell over her. Chloe looked at the faces of the villagers, at the empty eyes of the man who had been her friend, at the defeated slump of the man she had loved. She looked up at the grey, oppressive sky, at the ancient, silent stones of Skarfall that surrounded them, and she finally understood. You could not fight the silence. You could not run from it. The only thing you could do was listen to it. She took Maya's hand. Her friend's hand was cold and limp. Together they turned to face the silent, approaching congregation. They did not scream. They did not cry. There was no more noise left to make. This is the story of terror that no one survived to tell, because survival was never the point. The point was peace. The point was the deep, eternal, and all-consuming silence of Skarfall.